Measurements were performed on the shroud, but they were heterogeneous, and they had a directional aspect. So it was necessary to see what had happened. Perhaps pollution had taken place. So the first thing to do was to analyze fibers, Damon and Al are going to do exactly the opposite. Nature fails to stress the directional aspect, and it does not try to interpret the heterogeneity. No physical or chemical analysis is performed. The results are forged, thereby giving a wrong description of the sampling. The order in which the sample was supplied in the lab in 1989 has been changed. I turned to Professor Tab, who had taken part in this operation. He told me that he had forgotten to give me data. I myself was quite surprised by statistical analysis used on 3 samples. A chronometer had been used. It's quite strange for this calculation to be done with this kind of instrument. So
de l'âge médiéval, mesuré sur un lac.
The answer as to the medieval age measured on a cloth on the 1st century, and we have sufficient evidence to show it. This must be evidenced by the pollution of evidence. We must reason about the kinetics of an heterogeneous phase between fluids and solids, and as a solid we have the shroud, so we should reason in terms of a surface. A solid having a large surface is more easily polluted than a solid with a reduced surface. So we have not only a large outer but also a large inner surface. We have elements within fibers, and the substances perfectly absorb any kind of substance, and it is no mystery, since these tissues, these fabrics are used for bandages and shrouds. Quite often these tissues are covered with stains which can disappear when washed or can remain there. This is what happened.
Malheureusement, leur nettoyage.
But scientists did not care about this. They tried to interfere with samples to clean them. Unfortunately, this was of no use in our case. This is what I tried to do in 1989. Only the radiocarbon specialists understood what was the objective of my researches. Only with chlorhydric acid it is possible to eliminate the residues which are absorbed. What do we have here? I would like to state that the radiocarbon specialists, rather than using the results properly, mixed their papers. Here we have stalactites, carbonates, having a very ancient age when measured with radiocarbon dating. If we dissolve them, nothing is left. Perhaps carbonate could have been preserved on the shroud, but why? This is not the real cause for stains. The samples were washed with acid, and you see we have acids coming from the degradation of cellulose. Cellulose, as you know, is contained in flux in a high quantity. This is important because with the same weight of cellulose we have more carbon in the humic acid as compared with the sulfuric acid. Chemical formulas are complex. If everything had taken place according to the opinions of the expert, a higher presence of radiocarbon would have been found, which was not the case. So these acids have the characteristic of being fixed on carbonated objects, so that the alkaline attack we have quoted in the Netsch report was not sufficient in order to dissolve them. And what happens with a tissue? The tissue would dissolve. So we must note that up to date we have no washing process corresponding to this, and which can give us a precise dating. What do radiocarbon specialists do? They maintain the result if it is valid, and if it is not valid, they say it is to be dropped, that it is an outlier. Tissues were devoid of any pollution. They had been submitted to the C13 value. This test has no importance here because samples having an erratic age or which are outliers has just the same C13 content as the others. So let's come to our shroud. The shroud had been badly damaged during the fire of 1532. It had been damaged both by fire and water. Temperature had risen to very high values, 900 degrees, the melting temperature of silver. And you know that linen burns at 200 degrees. Anyway, it had not burnt. It had two different stains. One was characteristic for carbonization, and the sister, the nuns, had tried to mend this burning by inserting patches and trying to mend the burnt area. But there are also marks corresponding to water stains.
Avait été prélevés
So there were damages resulting both from water and fire. The samples had been taken exactly in the area where a water mark had been produced. Here we could have thought that the preliminary tests performed by Bonnelis et Tatre, and which were reported by Professor Charouz a few minutes ago, we could have thought that they took care of temperature influence, the temperature effect on the migration of radiocarbon on the shroud. The more so since many documents have been published as to this effect. So we could have thought this, but this was not done. Lise does just the opposite. They are going to choose the samples among well-preserved tissues, and if we take into account the heterogeneity of radiocarbon diffusion, they use samples coming from the same point, the same area. So the results were heterogeneous. This is extraordinary, but up to the present day nobody has remarked this striking fact. Lentercan, a sample which had been dated by 5 different labs, gives a really absurd result. We can say that the Arcan tunic is 1,000 years old and cannot be dated with radiocarbon, that it cannot be analyzed. the age of the linen temple, Shimur, is older than the archaeological era.
Plus jeune, c'est 80 ans de notre ère, c'est-à-dire le début de notre siècle.
Now the oldest era is the beginning of our century. We could think that the scientists would have apply their minds to the problem of this dating. We know that the fibers were tested simultaneously with the radiocarbon dating. It has been said that the sampling was to be taken away from charred areas. What was feared, since the best possible material was represented by carbon. Already in 1989, I had thought that there was a pollution due to the hydrothermal treatment of the shroud in 1989, since Feller had analyzed fibers in 1983. Had noted
Initialement à l'extérieur
that the iron, which was initially at the outside of the fiber, had penetrated within the fiber, since the latter had become amorphous, thereby creating rust stains, which could be noted on the shroud, and which the nuns were unable to remove. Since the shroud had been made amorphous, everything was performed by Heller. Heller observed that the shroud did not burn. I told myself that a benzyl-rich substance had perhaps been formed starting from cellulose, the formula of which is written here. There had been a loss of the oxygen and a reduction in the change.
For 4 years, I tried to persuade a lab to go on with this experiment I wanted to perform. Unfortunately, I didn't find any lab available to do that, up to a moment when I casually found a cloth, a synthetic cloth, which had escaped a fire in a supermarket, having traces which were not similar to the one of the shroud. They did not have rust stains due to fire, but this cloth had some stains due to sodium and some solvents. I asked for the possibility of eliminating these stains. I brought the cloth to laundry, and they said it was impossible, and that this cloth was later sent to Moscow, and preliminary studies were carried out on the cloth, and I would like to show you the following slide. Here you see the cloth. It's a cloth having black marks where previously some falls were present, and the analysis carried out by Professor Kuznetsko showed that enrichment was heterogeneous, and which ranged from 2 to 3% in some points, reaching 20% with radiocarbon, that is 12, 13 and 14. For me, it was an organic substance which reduced and led to carbon and turned into carbon. Since then, other experiences were made by Professor Kuznetsko on flax or linen cloth. So I'm finished with my communication. To conclude, however, I would like to say that the shroud is authentic. It dates back to the 1st century, and the research with carbon 14 are true. However, there are some embarrassing data have been taken away, and often elements were used to bring back dating to Middle Ages. We know and we see that this expertise is false twice. It cheated us not only as to the meaning of the statistical calculation, but it also cheated us by saying what the infallible character is of tests with carbon-14, especially on tissues. Therefore, the main contribution of carbon-14 tests where Professor Tai incorporated, which are tests and studies which are very unique, would lead to the working out of statistical treatment of a constellation of stains on the tissue. We would like to thank Professor Bestok, who financed experiences from Professor Busnesco. I'd like to thank Professor Juverneau, who worked out, who processed method data statistically with the results we all know. I would like to stress that Professor Van Halster, together with me, was a pioneer in this sector starting from 1990. And I'd like also to state that since the shroud is authentic, we have to acknowledge its authenticity, and therefore we have to worship this finding.